Hi, everybody, and welcome to another week of Optimizing Your Success. We are hosted each and every week by the Mentor Project, and we're so excited to be here because we have a great conversation today. Have you ever wondered why there are mirrors in front of elevators? Well, our guest tonight knows about this and so much more, and we are going to get to our guest, Thomas, in just a moment. But joining me, along with our guest, is our expert panel of extreme high achievers, including Janice Lintz, who is our #1 change maker with a special passion to help millions of people around the world with hearing loss. And Dr. Susan Bernstone, a clinical social worker, systems therapist, international coach, professor, TV talk show, producer and host, mental health consultant for the media, and a real connector. And of course, spreading sunshine, we have Devin Harris, our 3-time Olympian and original member of the Jamaican bobsledding team, featured in the movie Cool Runnings. And hopefully our friend Dr. Bruce Y. Lee will be joining us as well. But today we have a great guest. We have, now I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Thomas, help me out. Thomas Wedelsberg.
You got it. Amazing.
Author of the incredible book, What's Your Problem? He is an incredible author. He has written a couple of books, a ton of HBR articles. He's also a co-member with me of the Thinkers 50 Radar list and a competitor of mine for the Thinkers 50 Radar shortlist. So I like to keep my competitors close because I like to surround myself with people who are better than me. So, Thomas, what's your problem?
I have lots of those. I mean, isn't that like, it's always like, the people who write the book about the thing, they always suffer from kind of.
That's so true. It's so true. Thomas, I know you're now calling us from Denmark, where it's the middle of the night. And first, I want to thank you for really, burning the midnight oil with us to join us. But could you tell people your story, because you are from Denmark, you live mostly in the U.S. Tell everyone your story and how you got to here, to What's Your Problem?
I was in various fields. I spent some time in consulting. I spent some time in the Danish army, which is not a very terrifying place. Mostly what we do is run around and practice saying we surrender in different languages. But at some point, I think it's 16 years ago now, I started working together with one of my old professors. And that led us to co-author our first book together, Innovation as Usual, which came out with Harvard Business Press, and kind of was focused on the practicality of innovation. So when you have a normal job, when you're not necessarily in Google or Silicon Valley or in a startup garage, but maybe in the middle of a bureaucracy, I can't speak clearly now. It's late at night. Yes, exactly. That'll be my excuse throughout.
That is it.
Yeah.
You have a pass.
But basically this notion, if you're working in a bureaucratic company, in a big company, in a siloed company and so on, how do you actually still get new stuff done? And that was really that became my platform for doing a lot of the work I do now with companies all over the world in terms of helping them with innovation, and more recently, of course, the topic for today, with problem solving and problem framing.
So tell us about the catalyst of the reframing the problem, because I think what you're doing is absolutely genius. And Thomas and I had the opportunity to sit up and catch up, and I've seen the way his brain works. And trust me, if you ever get the opportunity to sit one-on-one with Thomas, grab it, because his brain it's unreal. And I literally interview high achievers for a living. So that's the best compliment I can give. Thomas, tell us how that all came about.
Well, it kind of, in a sense, grew out of my work with innovation, where it dawned on me more and more that there's a specific missing skill that even really talented people weren't necessarily good at. Like the really talented, like the high achievers that you're talking to, they're good at it. We know that from research too. But many people who could be good, they don't know what it is. And what am I talking about? I'm talking about this myth that problem solving has two components. Like, we analyze a problem and then we solve it. Yeah. That's great. But there is a critical third component, which is called framing the problem, meaning figuring out what problem to solve, or asking, hey, wait, are we actually solving the right problem? That skill is just like working with companies. I remember I was at this week, a big tech company in Silicon Valley. They had gathered something like 300 of their top performers internally. And I taught this workshop to them where I kind of shared, hey, here's how you go in and reframe a problem. Here's how you make sure you're solving the right problems. And it was new to them. Like that session, it was across an entire week. That was the one they said they got the most out of. And I thought that was insane. That's like, there's something wrong if there's this fundamental skill of making sure you're solving the right problem, of having the ability to question what problem you're solving. If people don't know that, well, we have to teach them. And that really led to my decision to write the book. And Harvard luckily agreed again that it was a good topic. So it came out here last year and has come out in 13 languages so far.
Whoa! Wow. Nice. So tell us about, and maybe we'll stick to English for this show. For what's your problem? What are if we were going to start to make sure that we're identifying the right problem? And I do qualitative research, and one of the reasons that we do this is because we want to make sure that we're identifying the right problem. And we had a guest a couple of weeks ago, Dr. Bob Lefkowitz, the Nobel Prize winner, who wrote in his book that the data is great, but you need to know the story behind it in order to make sure that you're solving the right problem. So take us through your thought process with this.
Well, I'd say it really starts with understanding how framing is different from just analyzing a problem. And that's where we come back to what you mentioned at the beginning. If you like, I loved the super simple example that is, you imagine that you are the owner of an office building, and that the tenants in the building, well, they're complaining about the elevator, that it is way too slow. Now, people who are, people have this tendency to just jump into action, and they go out and say, how do we make the elevator faster? There are people who are better at saying, wait a second, we need to analyze the problem. But they ask, why is the elevator slow? They still focus on the problem of the speed of the elevator, which may not necessarily be the right thing to focus on. And then there's reframing. And reframing is to go in and ask, wait, is this necessarily really about the speed of the elevator? Or is there something else going on? And the prototypical solution, of course, if you speak to an experienced landlord, well, it is to put up a mirror next to the elevator when you're waiting. So people they go, oh, they notice the mirror, they fall in love with their own image, they forget that they're waiting. That's a central illustration of the notion that sometimes you don't want to go in and solve or analyze a problem. You may actually want to go in and try to reframe it and see if there's a different problem you may be better off solving. And I've really been looking forward to this call as well, because I know that some of you have experiences with this too, and kind of in your field. So I'm very curious when Ruth takes us there to hear your stories around it.
Okay, well now you just gave me the platform, and I hear Janice giggling because Janice, I have to ask you. I mean, literally, the work you do is about reframing problems.
Well,
right?
I have to thank Thomas for it, because Thomas really helped me when he helped me set up my whole website. I mean, he really just helped me. I mean, I was
I think we can all say Thomas has helped us in some way.
In some way, yes. But I would say most of my work is about reframing the problem, that in hearing access, people always think they know the problem, and it is never the problem. And whether it's the hearing aids, which people think of a healthcare or ADA issue, and I realized it wasn't either of those, it was an oligopoly issue. And so that instead of going to the senators who always dealt with ADA issues, like Senator Harkin or Markey, I went to Senator, first off, they can only go to the well so many times because they have other constituents without hearing loss. So if you keep going to the same senators, you're getting in line. Whereas if you can go to a fresh senator who has never done anything in this field, you move right to the front. And so Senator Warren I viewed it as an oligopoly issue. And I specifically went to a presentation where she was speaking about credit cards and the CFPB and her work in the credit card industry, so I could approach her. And I will say, when I asked the question about disrupting the oligopoly, the person who was running the event was very upset with me because she didn't get it. And she thought I just somehow brought hearing aids into everything, as if hearing aids didn't really affect everything. But that's another issue. But that's part of the people who can't reframe. And so when you go into a problem and you ask something that seems tangential, but it's not, but thankfully Senator Warren got it. And then she introduced over-the-counter hearing aid bill. But I had the same issue with caption standards. With caption standards, everybody thought it was about going to the FCC. And it turned out it wasn't. It was really about first starting with television commercials, which I did. And everybody wanted the Super Bowl commercials. They thought that it was about getting the NFL involved. And my friend happened to be the general counsel of the NFL. So he said, no, we have no oversight, and nor does Fox. And so it was really about going to the advertisers. Well, when I went to the meeting with the Association of National Advertisers set up with the advertisers, it turned out the issue was really about a production schedule. And could they get the caption companies to, they had a very tight timeline by the time they got to the television commercial with the captions. And could they get it done fast enough? Well, a 30-second commercial, how long could it take to caption? And now think about this new revenue stream. Well, I knew if I called a few of the major caption companies and offered them all this extra money, they could quickly tighten up that schedule, which is what happened. And so it was, once we had that, the schedule problem, then they were happy to get the captions. And then we were able to put proof of concept. And I could then take that proof of concept from the Association of National Advertisers and bring that to the FCC chairman and say, look, I have proof of concept. Now, why can't you do this? And one FCC chairman couldn't be involved, but FCC Chairman Wheeler did, and he got it.
I mean, I love those examples, because what strikes me about the breakthroughs you've made here and the changes you've led is that this was not about inventing a new technology. This was literally, things had been away for a while. You came in, rethought what the challenge was, and went in and kind of, went to different stakeholders and figured out how to move it forward. And before you did that, things was just, I assume they were at a standstill. That's so fascinating to me. This was not about inventing, we have to use blockchain to do this. Mm-hmm. It was literally about rethinking the nature of the challenge that you're facing. I think that's such a powerful example, Janice, that you have there.
Thank you. It was exactly
big moves
that.
This week.
Yeah, it was exactly, both of those things were exactly. And the problem was, I find people do the same thing over and over again, and they didn't understand why they didn't advance, because they didn't reframe. And I think it's frustrating to me, because some of these things was, it wasn't that complicated. It was just really sitting and listening.
Yeah. Susan, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, and I'm so glad to be in this conversation. And Thomas, it's so good to see you again. And we've had this conversation a few years ago when we met, and you presented your work in a workshop, which was fabulous. As a therapist, this is a lot of reframing, right? When somebody comes in and to my virtual office now, and they tell me what the problem is, it's never the problem. What people identify as the problem, whether it's within themselves or with somebody else. I'm a family therapist. I, work with couples, individuals, companies, and the presenting problem is never really the problem. It's my first question is, and what's the problem with that? What is the problem? And so I can, give you lots of examples, but I won't right now. If anybody's interested, we can go through it. But even if you think in your own life on a day-to-day basis, when we think that we're experiencing a problem, to really sit back and say, wait, what is the actual problem with this? And then also just something that can also change things. It's a little bit different, Thomas, but similar, is rather than looking at it as a problem, is a challenge, because you can solve challenges, right? Like challenges are easy. But Thomas, I love your work and would love to hear more examples, because I know that you've been doing so much. And later on, I'd love to hear more examples of the work that you've been doing, because it's so important.
I mean, your field was one of the fields where I felt some of the greatest insights had been arrived at, because I saw so problem solving, not surprisingly, has been studied across tons of different disciplines because we have problems everywhere. I found many of them suffered from this very mechanical, not to badmouth engineers, but let me badmouth engineers, kind of, this very kind of, we need to measure everything and like understand all the details. Whereas in psychology, I think there has been this recognition that no, sometimes it's not about the details. You have to take a step back and look at things completely differently. An example I love that I write about in the book is my friend Tanya and her husband Brian, who used to fight a good deal. And, they had a happy marriage, but they got into these fights about the budget or whatever. And it got pretty acerbic. And they didn't like themselves when they were fighting. Initially, they went in and said, well, you had a very different childhood than I did. We come from two different cultures and we have a little bit different values and so on. And none of that moved the needle. I mean, it was all true, but it was difficult to change. As you know all about, like changing people's core values. That's a hard sell. What happened was that they noticed what's called a bright spot. And a bright spot was a point in time where the problem wasn't there, or where they solved it. It turned out they had a conversation about the budget. Normally they touch this topic. And it went fine. There was no issue whatsoever. And then Tanya asked, what was different about that discussion? And they realized, well, it was happening over breakfast. Most of the time, they were taking,
they were hangry.
Yeah, you know this, right?
Right.
They were having, they had listened to that horrible advice about never let the sun go down over your anger. And so they ended up taking most of their discussions after 10 in the evening. And everybody was hangry and tired and, the full thing. So she basically instigated a new rule with her and Brian, saying, if it's after 10 in the evening, then we're going to wait until the next morning to discuss this. And she credits this with solving something like 80% of their fights just disappeared due to this. It is such, to me, a powerful example of thinking differently. And even in this case, challenging some of the, the more traditional Freudian approaches about saying, oh, it has to be about your childhood. Maybe, but maybe there are also other ways we can think about this problem.
Maybe you just need an omelet.
An omelet or a divorce.
Yes. So Thomas, walk us through this. If I'm in an organization which doesn't change things, and I'm not saying that I am, but if I were in an organization that as its go-to motto is we've always done it that way, right? So we keep trying to solve problems in the same way all the time and then wonder why nothing changes. What would be our first steps of how to reframe this problem, how to look at it from a different angle, and how to have a different perspective?
There's really 3 steps to it. First and foremost, you just state the problem separately from the solution. So very simply the question, wait, what is the problem we're trying to solve? Ideally, you can write it down or get people to put it in an email, whatever you like. Step 2 is that you go in and try to challenge that understanding. So this can be a 10-minute process where you gather, say we're on a call right now, and it's almost like you brainstorm, but instead of brainstorming for solutions, you go in and brainstorm for questions. You go in and ask, wait, this issue with the slow elevator, are there other ways of thinking about what's going on? Are they all arriving at the same time of day? Might it be the wait time that's the issue, or something else? For that part, you do want to have other people involved. It's possible to reframe your own problems, but it's hard to do. You're kind of too close to your own problems to see them clearly. Yep. And so kind of just spending 10 minutes just going in and kicking the tires a little bit about on your understanding of the problem. The third step, and this is critical, is to figure out how to move forward. We've had this myth in our heads about problem diagnosis needing to take endless amounts of time. We need to go 2 weeks to the mountains, think deep thoughts about everything. And if you think that's the case, if you think that's the case, you never get it done, because who has 2 weeks to head to the mountains?
Yeah.
And so it is much more an iterative process. It's just the importance of questioning, asking questions along the way, and kind of going in and then taking a step forward. And then maybe next week you go back and say, wait, given what we did this week, did we learn something new about the problem? Now, I'm super curious to get, some of you work with this, like, what has been your observation in getting this done? Or like, Susan, what have you seen with people resisting reframing? Or what did you see, Janice, in your process? Or Bruce or Devon, for that matter, what you've seen in terms of how to help people rethink their problems?
I'm curious to hear first from Devon, if you could, because I tell people that 4 guys from a tropical island, right, competed on a sled on ice, and they never even saw the course until they got to the Olympics. Everyone said it was impossible, but yet you guys didn't. You had a completely different mindset, and you completely reframed the problem. And in fact, the people who brought you on said sprinters make good bobsledders, right? Something that other people haven't thought of. So take us back there.
So I'm here and listening. Are you guys hearing me?
Yeah.
Thomas. And so I had a couple of questions. The first one was, as I was listening to you, I was wondering where the dissonance was, between this idea of reframing and analyzing, right? So I am the typical type A personality. The elevator is moving too slowly. Let's go fix it. Let's get it moving faster. Why is it that we're not spending time reframing and just jumping towards finding a solution?
I'm tempted to throw that one to Susan, because she said before something really interesting, right? Around people keep trying the same solution, even if it doesn't work. My concern is not that we jump to solutions. That's great, because sometimes that's enough and it can solve the problem. My concern is, or my question is, why do people do this even after having tried the solution several times and knowing it doesn't work? Like, and Susan, what have you seen with your clients or patients?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. It's a really good question, and it's familiar. First of all, I think that sometimes the ways in which we think about the problem is, if we want to go real psychological, that solution started because it was for a survival mechanism.
Yeah.
So we actually, that piece of the solution, it worked at one time. How we were looking at the problem, how we were defining the problem, there was some time in our life that worked. It's no longer useful, but it's familiar. And you all think about, our own lives. We like what's familiar. Even if it doesn't work, it's comfortable. And so change is scary and hard. And when we do something unfamiliar or something that we were not used to, that keeps us doing the same thing. Just try to pick up your cell phone with your other hand and talk on using the other hand, and you'll see how much resistance, and that's meaningless. There's no emotionality connected to that. So one is that it's familiar. The other is that we tell ourselves stories all the time and make up stuff in our heads. So when we look at problems, we're thinking about, like, that must be the problem. And we keep telling ourselves that is the problem. That has to be the problem. It's like, I love the example that you gave of the couple that, they and if they went for couples counseling, the therapist could have been involved in looking at that problem from a million different ways. But I loved what you said in terms of what was different and what worked, because I spend a lot of time on, let's look at what works. And people don't go for consultations to therapists, to coaches on, they come in ready to say, all right, this is the problem. And I look at and ask about, all right, let's look at what's working. What worked this week to really examine, because the assumption is we have to look at what's wrong. No, I want to know what's right sometimes.
Absolutely. It's a very powerful question to go in with. And that question comes originally from, this is Steve DeShazer, who in the 80s kind of comes up with this within psychology and therapy.
Yeah.
I would add one more aspect to that. Like, why do we keep not reframing? Well, actually two. First and foremost, people don't know how. Like literally, this is not a skill that anybody taught you.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
some people pick it up, some people may have a natural affinity towards it, but there's nowhere. Compare this to negotiation. If you want to learn how to negotiate, you can take a 2-day course anywhere, or a 1-day course, whatever. If you want to learn how to reframe, that's not something we have been teaching people even in school. So that's like, it's basically a how-to problem. And on top of that, I would say, what sometimes happens is that people fall in love with a particular understanding of the problem because it allows them not to change. Like,
yes.
Yeah. And I want to add to that, Thomas, because there's a game. You know, one of the things that I do oftentimes with people is think about, you know, depending on what the issue is in the work, it's sometimes, okay, if you solve this, right, if it looks different, what else will happen? Because sometimes we're protecting those other changes. In my case, when I'm working directly with people, how would your relationship to this other person change? How would your relationship to yourself change if you solve that? If you solve one, and Bruce, I think needs to talk about this, because Bruce, we've talked about this, how in the medical field, how there are lots of companies that are resisting solving the problems, because if you solve one problem, they're going to have another huge problem that might be financial. Right? You're no longer going to make money if you solve a certain medical problem. You're going to put people out of business, and I think that you know that's the consequence of solving a problem.
And I'd add to that, there's an identity component. Like there's sometimes you actually have to think differently about who you are,
right?
In order to do this. I think Lisa Cohn, who's somebody Ruth and several of you know, came out recently with a book called From Startup to Grown Up, where she talks about how many founders, as they grow, they resist putting in place organizational structures because they hate corporate things. Like they're like, no, I'm a startup person. I'm not about big companies. And so they resist implementing tools that can help them, and they try too long to keep a flat organization, which isn't viable once you grow beyond a certain number. So both on a very pragmatic level, like what else needs to change, and just on a who am I level, if you will.
The consequence, I like to call it, it's the consequence of change.
Hey,
So
Bruce,
I'm thinking here.
Kevin, hold on. I'm curious, Bruce, if you could weigh in here about how you're seeing this in your field.
Well, Thomas, you already made me reframe the question, because today is National Cook for Your Pets Day. So I was so busy looking for the right picture of a pet. But when you mentioned mirrors, I decided to pick a mirror instead. So
I thought you were just calling in from your shower, because it looked like shower doors.
So I realized the solution is always put more mirrors everywhere.
That's it. That's a solution.
But I do have an example from global health. So I'd say about 15 years ago, we were a problem was brought to us, and people were saying, okay, you know, with vaccines, when you want to distribute vaccines, would it be helpful to make vaccines thermostable? Meaning that, can you make vaccines, you know, leave them out and make them thermostable so you don't have to refrigerate them and put them in a freezer? So we were working with the Gates Foundation and the World Health Organization and other organizations like that, and then we went into several countries, one in Africa, one in Southeast Asia. And then we said, okay, let's see what the issue is. And we said, okay, in order to understand the value of this type of technology, we have to build a map and a model of the supply chain to distribute the vaccines, you know, the whole set of steps to distribute the vaccines, because this can help us understand the value of making something thermostable. In the process of doing that, we found that there are all these problems with the supply chain, that actually the problem was a lot bigger, that even if you change the vaccines, you still would have situations where the vaccines wouldn't even reach the people. And we went back to the big organization and said, hey, you know, you've got to look at this problem. And many people were like, wait. The original problem was just looking at the vaccine. Do we make it thermostable or not? And we said, wait, there's a bigger problem. It took us about 3 or 4 years to convince everyone around the world that this actually was a bigger problem. And finally, everyone saw it. And then people started redesigning the supply chains around the world. So I think that was an example of, a smaller problem became a gateway to a larger problem that actually, I think, solved a lot more problems along with it.
And I loved about that too, something I've seen, namely that people often think a problem is solved when it is not solved. I saw a similar story in a different world, but in Samsung, where their European innovation department finds out that there's this app that, if you buy an Apple phone and then you want to switch to a Samsung, then it can transfer all of your data to the new phone. And Samsung thought that app worked fine. Only when they started to go in and look at user behavior around this, they realized that people felt it didn't work and they resisted buying a new phone because of it. And they ultimately went out. Interestingly, lovely story, but the headquarters in Samsung, they were kind of resisting this. So they actually, in the European division, they ended up just building a new app and launching it kind of under the radar. And that they were immediately saw a ton of downloads of it and people started using it. Just going in and saying, wait, you think this problem is solved, but actually it's not. Let's fix this thing. And I think that's a beautiful example, Bruce, of what you saw there in the medical space too.
That's what Dr. Charlie Camarda, who's a mentor here with the Mentor Project and one of the astronauts in my book, really talks about having this rogue thing that was done on the side because it wasn't happening within the organization. So they had to do a rogue project. Devin, I'm hoping that you can weigh in here. And then Janice, I'd love to hear from you as well.
Yeah, sure. So as I was listening to Thomas and Susan earlier about and we know people are very resistant to change. It seems to me, Carol Dweck comes to mind, and this whole business of a growth mindset. Because if you are working on a problem and you're using the same strategies and tools and you're getting the same results, it seems to make sense to me anyway that you should do something differently. And so people with this growth mindset, as Carol talks about, are not resistant to this idea of learning new skills and trying new things. So to go back to what you asked about earlier, Ruth, Jamaica bobsled, I think it's one of those perfect examples, I think, of a group of guys who were just willing to go try something new and different and perhaps a little bit crazy. But in the process, back to Thomas, reframing the problem. Jamaica is 96 degrees in the shade, never see snow. How do you create a bobsled team? And if you stop thinking that a bobsled team has to come from a temperate climate country, you start to see how you can create a pathway to go from sand, sea, and surf to snow and ice-capped mountains in Calgary. I think that applies across the board to any issue we have.
Beautiful.
So true.
And seeing something interesting here too, like new solutions coming from, sometimes we call it the fringes, but really unexpected places, like places where you don't have the standard conditions that everybody else is working under, that have different constraints. That sometimes forces new thinking and new creativity. So very often, I think Rita McGrath talks about this thing about snow melts from the edges. Other people talk about this kind of frontier space, like where do things are field, where does it border to new things or are seeing new constraints and so on. Those places often surface really interesting solutions as indeed it happened here in Jamaica with your bobsled team.
And Thomas, I think that's why I always tell people, and I note that high achievers do this as well, they surround themselves with people who are different than them. Because we had a guest several months ago, Hondo Gertz, who was the Undersecretary of the Navy, Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And he said that innovation is really poaching other people's ideas and using them in a new way. And which I thought was really a light bulb moment, right? And he said, you do that by really surrounding yourself with as many diverse people as you can. And it's true. You have to surround yourself with people who are inside your industry, outside your industry, and all the other ways that we can put diverse teams together. So Janice, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
I completely agree with that. The other thing is, I think sometimes when you were saying, Thomas, how people are comfortable, I think part of that comfort is they never actually fully pursue. If they say something works, they never actually check to see if it works. And they just make assumptions. And when you dig into a problem and you find out it doesn't work, and then you have to figure out how to pivot, I think that's sometimes where the creative solutions come into place. Because I think people sadly get lazy. It's easy to just do same old, and it takes a lot of work to try something different or figure out, does it really work? And I think that's part of the problem, is figuring out how can you, if you try something and it doesn't work, then the question is, okay, what can you do to make it work? And then when you pursue that path, that's when it starts to become, you come up with a new solution, because you have to find a new path.
I think one of the most important insights around problems that you're highlighting here is that they aren't static. Problems change over time. And when you then go in and try with a new solution, well, something shifts in the space you're in. And then you have to, you're never just solving one problem. It's almost this mentality of constantly just going in and questioning the problem and rethinking and trying new things with it. As you were talking, I came to think of an example of PayPal's origin history, where most people kind of focus on, well, they did this thing where they were the first to come up with, like, you could transfer money via the web and so on, and great solution. Many of the big players, including the banks, tried to emulate PayPal, and many of them failed. Why was that? The issue, or the second order issue that PayPal ran into and that they solved, was fraud. What happened with the entrants was they came in, they tried to grow big against PayPal, and when they were small, they were fine. When they then grew bigger, all of the criminals came rushing in, and they systematically tried to do fraud on these platforms. PayPal had paid attention to that, and they had become really, really good at fraud detection. The other players that came in were blindsided by it. They just thought, no, the problem we're solving is money transfers, and we can do that as well as PayPal. Yeah, they could, but they missed that there are several layers to the problem, and that they had to keep an eye out for new developments and attack and solve those two.
Susan, very quick comment, and I really want to get to Thomas's thought process about how he himself reframes things when he's working on projects. Susan, go ahead.
The other thing, even though it was said, I just want to also state it, it's also who has the problem. Who is this a problem for? Because sometimes, particularly in companies, you have people that are advocating because they think it's a problem for their customer, and they think it's a problem for their workers. But you really need to go to the actual department, to those employees, to those workers, to find out what the problem is for them, because that problem, it's like playing telephone, and the problem gets kind of changed as the person, says who's it's a problem for. So I just wanted to add that. I know that it was kind of in what you said, Thomas, but I wanted to highlight that as well. And I'd love to hear, Ruth, that the answer to how Thomas thinks.
Well, I can actually give a very short answer to that, which is part of my work in doing this was to come up with or identify strategies that work well when you ask questions. Like when you go in and try to reframe a problem, what are the good questions? What are not good questions? And a not so good question is, for instance, asking why 5 times, because that digs you deeper into the first definition of the problem. Why is the elevator slow? So here's the brief summary, and I'll kind of just run you through these, because you can actually download them here. I put out a checklist. It's part of the book, but it's also available for free on the website, howtoreframe.com. We'll put the link in here. But it's basically 5 strategies that I dug up from research and that I tested live on a ton of different companies that are really helpful at getting new angles surfaced on a problem. We've touched on one of them already, the bright spots method that Susan brought up. We've touched on this thing about looking outside of the original framing. So like with the elevator, asking, what if this is not about the speed of the elevator? 3 other good questions are, what's our goal? Like, what does success look like? And can we potentially rethink the nature of success? What is my role in creating this problem? We tend to think that we're innocent victims, subject to other, some idiots over here are harassing us and creating problems. Often there's something in our own behavior that is contributing to a problem, if not necessarily causing it. And finally, just this.
I love that one, by the way, Thomas.
It's so powerful. Like it's just,
that's a big one.
It is.
And if the problems are always coming to you, maybe it's not other people. Maybe you're the problem.
Exactly. That's a good reflection to have. I try to avoid doing it myself because it's very painful. It's
and we're all victims of it.
Exactly. And so the final strategy is really just perspective taking. Like we assume again that people are idiots or they are malevolent or whatever. And in reality, something else is typically going on. So if you have a conflict with your sister or whatever, perspective taking is to ask genuinely, not just to feel what she feels, but to go in and say, what's going on her side of the fence? Why is she acting this way? What problem is she trying to solve? Trying to genuinely see her as a potential as a good person who's acting for reasonable concerns or whatever, instead of just blindly assuming that, oh, she must be an idiot or she has it out for me or whatever it is. So those 5 strategies collectively, they can help. They once you get better at kind of knowing what questions to ask, you will get a lot better at reframing. And again, you can download these for free on the website. You don't have to yield your email or anything else. It's out there if you want to delve deeper.
And if you are looking at the book, What's Your Problem? It is on the last page. And I like how you perfed it so that people can actually rip it out and put it right in front of them. But one of the things that you do list, because I have the reframing checklist in front of me, is you finish it up with the 101 of adult learning, right? Learning doesn't happen until you reflect and then act based on that reflection. So you listed in all the reframing, all the reflection pieces, but then you wrote move forward. How do we keep the momentum going, which is the action piece, which is what's so necessary if we're going to do that. So brilliant. It's as if you studied adult learning.
The only thing I'd say with the action step is it doesn't necessarily have to be building the solution. It can also just be validating the problem. Going in, for instance, and in this conflict with your sister, trying to say to her, hey, it seems like this may be going on your side. Is that right? Just going in and making sure you actually have a good understanding of the problem before you start launching your favorite solution or whatever it is.
Brilliant. Thomas, thank you so much for joining us in the middle of the night today. All of our panelists and Thomas, you can have all of their contact information. It's in the chat. But Thomas, give us a shout out. Where can people find out more about you? And the name of your book again is?
Yeah, the book is, as you've so nicely held up, What's Your Problem? I can't recite to you the 13 other languages is out. I think the Russian.
But don't you have it in Danish? Can't you hold up the Danish one?
Well, the Danish version, that's surprisingly called What's Your Problem as well, with the Danish subtitle, which says solve your biggest problems through reframing. For those of you who want to learn Danish.
Love it. You got Eric Schmidt, former CEO of Google, to endorse it. That's impressive.
Thank you. Yeah, that happened because a friend of mine texted me and said, have you read Eric Schmidt's new book, $1 Trillion Coach? You should, because you're mentioned in it on page 86. Or 68, well, I think it was. So Eric Schmidt had come across some of my research on reframing and cited it in his book. So that was really the connect there.
Beautiful. Thomas, Thank you so much for joining us today in the middle of the night, your time. I'm so excited that you were here. And thank you to Janice Lins, Dr. Bruce Wiley, Devin Harris, Dr. Susan Bernstone, and Dr. Debbie Heiser, who's behind the scenes with the Mentor Project, making us all look and sound glamorous. And I'm Dr. Ruth Gotian. Thank you very much for joining us this week and every week. See you next time.